On August 1st, 1944, amidst World War II, a faction of white transit operators at the Philadelphia Transit Company staged an impromptu strike that would soon garner national attention. The workers were not striking for elevated wages or improved working conditions, but instead were protesting the promotion of 8 African American workers to the position of trolley driver. With Philadelphia being a major production center for wartime resources, President Roosevelt dispatched federal troops and quickly shut down the strike. While the strike only lasted for a day, its causes and lasting legacy provide a glimpse into a darker, untold narrative of racial segregation in the North and battles for democracy fought not overseas against Nazi Germany, but here on America's home front. In 1940, Philadelphia was the third largest city in America, with a population of 1.9 million. 10 years later, the population topped 2 million. Many of the new arrivals were African American, with the black population of Philadelphia jumping from 250,000 to 375,000, a total increase of about 50% in just a decade.
But by the time you get to the 1940s, you have a second Great Migration, is what it's often called, with tens of thousands more African Americans moving to the city for war work. And the city's growing black population at the same time. The white population is staying steady or even declining a little bit. So as a percentage, black Philadelphians are becoming a larger and larger percentage of the population.
Philadelphia also served as America's third biggest wartime production center. The city relied on African Americans and women to operate jobs vacated by men who enlisted in the Army.
The saying went that the city produced everything from battleships to braid. So the city was the third largest war production center in the United States, not because it did any one thing, but because it created so many different things.
The city relied on the PTC's trolley system to get to and from work every day. Without the PTC, the city would effectively shut down and would cease to produce everything from clothing to steel to ammunition, all resources necessary for the war effort.
So if you shut down the trolleys and the subways and the buses, that means that essentially the war industries are going to come to a halt. So it's not so much about the trolley system itself, it's that without the trolley system, you can't run the war production center.
For years, the PTC engaged in a gentleman's agreement with the Philadelphia Rapid Transit Employees Union that reserved the highest paying jobs for whites and kept African American workers in menial positions of hard, dirty, and low paying labor. In 1944, however, subduing to political pressure to integrate the PTC, employees voted to elect a new representative union, the left-leaning Transport Workers Union. The TWU representatives bargained with PTC management to not only increase wages, but to extend the better paying jobs to African American employees. When the PTC decided to promote 8 African Americans to the position of trolley driver, a faction of white workers looking to protect their job security, keep the PTC segregated, and ultimately undermine the TWU's authority, decided to strike. The striking workers called in sick on August 1st, 1944, and the PTC shut down, with the rest of the city close behind.
But the North was entirely segregated at the time. Neighborhoods were segregated, jobs were segregated. So what did it mean that you had tens of thousands of African Americans coming north seeking jobs in war industries? They had to find a place to live. They had to find jobs and in these places to live, and in places of leisure, places away from work like amusement parks, which was the source of a riot in Detroit, and in housing, conflicts erupt. And so the strike, the transit strike here in Philadelphia, is very much a product of those tensions. Whites who had long had control over their neighborhoods, who had long had access to better jobs, who had long had the best places to sit in leisure, did not want to yield those willingly.
The transit strike and the white workers' resistance to yield their privilege speak to a larger trend of racial tensions that are plaguing the North during World War II. The Great Migration challenged the institution of white supremacy in many northern cities and created a social climate prime for conflict.
You have to situate what's happening in Philadelphia in the larger American context and understand that race relations aren't just a Southern problem, they're an American problem. Right? So there's a lot of tensions around racial issues across the United States, particularly as African larger cities in the South and then moving into the North as well.
Black leaders across the country saw the war as an opportunity to push for social and political change. The NAACP increased its membership from 18,000 before the war to 500,000 at its close. The percentage of registered black voters in the South went from 2 to 12%. Black activists across the country took it upon themselves to highlight America's hypocrisy as a country fighting a war in the name of democracy while it practiced segregation and discrimination at home. Black newspapers in Chicago created the WWII campaign, which called for victory over America's enemies abroad and over Jim Crow at home.
And so, well, you have on abroad a fight against fascism. At home, you have a real struggle in daily space about the meanings of democracy. And that's really what the strike is about. It's about who has access to jobs, who has access to places to live, who has access to transportation, and who has access to leisure. All of those are sort of the strike sort of revolves around.
But you might interrogate a little bit how democratic was the United States. I mean, women had only been allowed to vote for about a generation. Most African Americans in this country are disenfranchised. So African Americans, I think, were particularly adept at pointing out that hypocrisy of, really taking up what they called the WWII campaign as a serious challenge to whether or not America was all that much better than our adversaries.
Roosevelt, facing election in just 2 months, was stuck between a rock and a hard place. He did not want to seem as if he was attacking his base of everyday working citizens, but he also needed Philadelphia's industry for the American war effort. A day after the strike started, President Roosevelt dispatched federal troops to Philadelphia and issued an executive order that ordered the striking PTC employees back to work. In an attempt to downplay the strike's racial undertones, Roosevelt did not find the PTC in violation of the Fair Employment Practices Committee, an executive order issued in 1941 that outlawed discrimination in the workplace.
Right. I mean, Roosevelt's known as somebody who is not overly sympathetic to African Americans. He wasn't really willing to extend a lot of political capital for issues like anti-lynching laws and those kinds of things. There's a lot of historical studies about, the racism embedded in New Deal laws and policies. So most people looking at this strike, they would say that, Roosevelt did the right thing, but he didn't necessarily do it to support African Americans. He did it to get the city operating again because they needed the war production.
The strike demonstrated the means to which white Americans were willing to go in order to protect their privileges. The workers' willingness to strike in order to hinder integration in the workforce foreshadows a pattern of white resistance to integration in the century to come.
And that's the legacy of white resistance to integration. And that really is the story, really, of the civil rights movement, as whites resist, again, African Americans moving into and integrating neighborhoods, as whites resist having African Americans sort of participate in the jobs that they had before. I think one of the hints that you have in the transit strike is this is the beginning of a kind of white resistance to integration that you'll see shaping the post-war city and the landscape of the post-war metropolitan world. I really do think, in many ways, the story of the 20th century in the United States, as W.W.I. Boy said, is the color line, but it's how assiduously people protect their place in the color line and don't want outside groups crossing that line.
The transit strike, at face value, seems relatively simple. White employees strike in protest of increasing black competition for jobs. But when considering the historical context of the strike, the implications of the Great Migration on race relations in the North, the effects of World War II on America's home front, and the struggle for equal rights amidst a war rooted in democracy and freedom, the story suddenly becomes a lot more complicated. What we are left with is a narrative, not just about a strike, not just about race, and not just about a war, but instead a narrative about America for a century to come.